Adam, how you going?
I'm doing well. I'm traveling. Is that the right response in Australian or no?
It doesn't translate
Okay,
that
it's
way.
not a response. It's just a question.
No, traveling just means traveling. Just
Yeah.
for anyone watching or listening, earlier I asked Adam, "How you traveling?" And then I hadn't realised that that might be something that people outside Australia don't actually say. What I intended to ask was, "How are you going?" Um, and it sounds like he is going.
Oh, I'm going. Yeah, yeah.
He's going. All
But I
right.
was rather confused, but I'm happy I understand that.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, we just take for granted that these things are completely universal here. And I
Mhm.
guess considering we're about to have a conversation about language and generalizability, um, it's an accidentally pretty neat segue. So, Adam, do you just want to maybe briefly introduce yourself? And what does your life look like right now?
Yeah, so I'm Adam Louis-Klein. I'm a PhD candidate in Montreal at McGill University. And I actually work in the Amazon with an indigenous tribe, and that's where I was prior to October 7th. I was living in a remote village with no phone or internet, no connection to the outside world for several months, thinking with this very different non Western people. And it was on October 9th that I came back to a small town, still within the Amazon, but I sort of plugged back in for the first time. And the first thing I saw when I opened my computer were images of the Nova Music Festival that people were sharing on Facebook. And then the second thing that happened was that I saw that people were already starting to circulate photos of people burning Israeli flags and professing loyalty to the resistance. And I was very soon sort of purged from all of my social and professional networks within the academic world. And I felt that I needed to keep speaking out nonetheless. And so I tried to use my own academic background to come to a critical understanding of what was happening to myself and what was happening to the Jewish community. And I ended up writing more and more about anti Zionism. And then I found a group of activists who were also moving in this direction, really wanting to name anti Zionism and make anti Zionism legible, really, as the Jew hatred of our time and the specific libels of anti Zionism. The colonizer apartheid genocide libels, the specific way in which anti Zionists target Jews. And so then I founded the movement against anti Zionism just a couple months ago, but we've been growing incredibly fast. And we are working to change the culture and the language that we use in the Jewish community into one that can speak back to anti Zionism and stop the mainstreaming of anti Zionism that's happening, that's taking over institutions, and that's legitimizing violence against Jews.
Okay, wow. So there's a lot there, but just to peel back, it sounds like this is a reaction that has happened post October 7th, right?
Yeah, I was not doing any of this work prior to October 7th. It was not a choice in many ways for me. I was thrown into this, I was forced into it from my experience in the academy, in the left academic world, and being purged, and the kind of explosion of Jew hatred that I saw that was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed in my life. And I felt like I had no choice but to basically dedicate my life now to fighting it.
Okay, sure. But, most of us, October 8th really noticed groups of people that we considered very reasonable, like minded friends, for lack of a better word, allies. Maybe they were colleagues, people we're studying with, people who'd kind of always seemed to say and do the quote unquote right things in response to the world's myriad and never ending moral challenges. But for some reason, at least this was my experience, there seemed to be this moral fracturing on October 8th, where I all of a sudden felt like I was on the other side
Mhm.
of this great moral debate. And I, along with many other Jews, interpreted this as well, they are being anti Semitic, but they don't know they're being anti Semitic. So it's my responsibility to
Mhm.
very gently and carefully concede a lot of ground in order to help them understand their conspiratorial ways of thinking, these libels, these conspiracies. But I guess what you seem to be delivering to this conversation is that most of that was completely reasonable a reaction, but for the hinging on one particular word. And that's the word that I think brings you and I together, and a lot of people around the world increasingly with this movement against anti-Zionism. At
Mhm.
what point did you decide that anti-Semitism was not adequately encapsulating the reaction on October 8th?
I think it took a while, actually, because my immediate experience was, wow, this is anti-Semitism. That was the language I reached for. It was the language that was available, the language I had learned about. When I felt that visceral feeling that these people hate Jews, and they hate me for my Jewish identity. I'm being marked as a Zionist, and they're attacking me and harassing me as a so-called Zionist. They're spreading libels about Israel, and I'd heard them say, "Oh, this is criticism of Israel. It's not anti-Semitism, etc." But I had that visceral experience of them attacking me, and just the tone of voice, the way they would speak, that told me that this is anti-Semitism, and that's the language I was using. But as I tried to understand their own claims and analyze them and really dig deeper into the ideology they were constructing about Israel as a white settler colonial state that's based on Jewish supremacy, that's committing a genocide, or that's been committing a genocide since 1948, as a kind of protracted genocide that's sort of intrinsic to Israel's essence. I came to understand this more and more as a particular ideology that was anti-Zionism itself. And eventually I realized that one can grasp anti-Zionism as an ideology, but one also almost needs to go further in one's language beyond just saying anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, right? Because when we do that, we collapse. All of that work we just did to see anti-Zionism as its own Jew hatred and its ethnicity is suddenly collapsed. We only have one objective, it's to mark it as anti-Semitic, and we sort of reproduce the paradigm that's actually part of anti-Zionism itself. Criticism of Israel, when does it cross the line into anti-Semitism? This paradigm is kind of being reproduced by anti-Zionists and many Jews, right? Because anti-Zionists will say, Bondi Beach, well, that was anti-Semitism. I'll acknowledge that was anti-Semitism. It has nothing to do with my anti-Zionism and my anti-Zionist libels. Then Jews themselves will want to be like, well, I want to criticize Israel. They aren't seeing anti-Zionism. They misrecognize it as criticism of Israel. And then they will reproduce the same schema. Okay, sometimes it crosses the line, but no one even knows where this line is. So I increasingly realized too that crossing the line discourse was completely ineffective, and that calling anti-Zionism anti-Semitism tends to still be in that same space, and it still allows for that space of denial. Essentially, well, this isn't anti-Semitic. And it was working with the Maz group where we together as a community, we've sharpened this language even more. And my colleagues have really helped me also come to a greater understanding of how to sort of fully disarticulate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, but as two forms of Jew hatred. So that anti-Zionism should not be mapped onto classical anti-Semitism. And so there's almost this grain of truth in what anti-Zionists say, that they are not anti-Semitic. So they aren't actually classically anti-Semitic. Their own differentiation from classical anti-Semitism benefits them in that sense, as long as we aren't stigmatizing and drawing attention to anti-Zionism itself.
Right. So when you talk about this crossing the line understanding of anti-Zionism into anti-Semitism, we hear this a lot, right? Like, I'm not being an anti-Semite, I'm being an anti-Zionist. And I
Mhm.
guess what I wanted to understand a bit better is whether or not there is a line to be crossed, or whether these are just completely separate entities. I feel like that line is constructed as a moral boundary. On one side of the boundary is anti-Zionism, and that's a completely reasonable way to be. And on the other side is anti-Semitism, a horrible, barbaric, you're a Nazi, you're a terrible person. But despite that barrier being very, very obviously moralistic, I'm wondering whether there's any real practical uh, flow between these two things. I mean, is there a chance that sometimes someone is being an anti-Zionist and is also an anti-Semite? is someone who is an anti-Semite also an anti-Zionist? And how today, when someone is being an anti-Zionist and that anti-Zionist rhetoric is causing harm, can we prosecute that that is causing harm and that it doesn't matter whether you're being anti-Semitic or not?
Hmm. Yeah, so I think once you recognize them as two types, they're types that can fuse, right? But they're also independent variables, right? So if you think about classical anti-Semitism, European anti-Semitism emerged in the 19th century with people like Wilhelm Marr, and then culminated in the Nazis. Their ideology was really about kicking Jews out of Europe. And so they were concerned with Jews as a kind of infiltrating race into their nation states, right? And so anti-Semitism is always kind of about that. The Jews are foreigners that are infiltrating our society, right?
But may I
And
just,
mhm,
sorry, may I just interrupt you for a moment though? I mean, if we're talking about these moral boundaries, is it not interesting at the very least that Wilhelm Marr and his contemporaries constructed anti-Semitism as a more morally lofty Judenhass, right? Jewish
mhm,
hate. You know, this was an understanding of the fact that, well, we know that people have been anti, Jewish and there's been Judeophobia or there's been Judenhass, or, but we're not like them. We now inhabit a modern world of race science, right? Um, yeah, so I just wanted to mention that because that feels
yeah,
really awkwardly parallel to today.
it's exactly parallel. So it's just the same evolutionary process. In the same way that anti-Semitism emerged as a new moral form of Jew hatred that incorporated the moral values of the time of civilization, progress, the nation state, science, etc., and then differentiated itself from the old barbaric form of Judenhass, even sort of recognizing, oh, Jews have been persecuted in the past, yes, but that's not what we're doing now. That is identical to how anti-Zionism has emerged as the next dominant form of Jew hatred today, through saying that it is an updated form and it's not this barbaric thing of the past because it's in accordance with the moral values of our time, right? So the great moral values of our time since World War II are basically opposition to genocide, the Holocaust, opposition to racism, the whole system of human rights, the rejection of Nazism, and apartheid South Africa, and decolonization with the creation of all of these new African and Asian states out of the rubble of European colonialism. So the colonizer, apartheid, and genocide libels are really just ways of fitting Israel into the moral calculus of our time. And when you tell someone there's a state that's a colonizing apartheid genocidal state, that person's almost instantly going to get angry, right? Because we actually all live in this moral system. Basically, anyone you meet, it's just a basic part of our civilization that colonialism, racism, and genocide are the great evils. And so these libels serve to construct Israel as the inverse of what's treated as good in our time, as a kind of scapegoat, in the same way that the libels of the past posed Jews as a kind of obstacle to redemption or an obstacle to a better world based on the values of the time. But anti Semitism has not disappeared. So to say that anti Zionism is the dominant form of Jew hatred in our time is not to say that there aren't classical anti Semites. And of course, you find anti Semitism more on the right. It's more closely connected to nationalist ideology and the sense that Jews don't really belong in our nation state. But you also sometimes find it on the left when people incorporate sort of conspiracy theories of Jews as a threatening presence, also in leftist spaces as well. So, and then there's also sort of fusions that exist, right? So anti-Semitic conspiracies do fuse with anti-Zionism. So in the U.S., we hear a lot about like AIPAC, right, which is a lobby of Americans who basically just support the U.S.'s relationship with Israel. So it's a mid-level lobby, but it's imagined as immensely powerful and is influencing all U.S. politicians and basically determining what the U.S. government does. So that is very much a common classical anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, and we find that on the left as well. So it's a kind of left-wing anti-Semitism. But it's not the same as a kind of purified anti-Zionism, which you also find, which is when someone isn't necessarily engaging in those very explicit conspiracies of government and media control, but they are constructing Israel as a kind of inherent evil, sort of the most evil state on this planet because it's inherently genocidal, colonial, etc. It encapsulates everything that's wrong in the world, and that anti-Zionism is its own form of Jew hate.
Right, okay. But you mentioned that there's this kind of level of atonement almost when it comes to pursuing the Jew underneath an anti-Semitic framework, right? Some type of we're going to amend some issue within ourselves or within our society or whatever it is. It's almost as though the Jew takes on some purifying symbol for an individual or society. Would you just briefly explain just how that works in anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, and then anti-Zionism?
Yeah, so in anti-Judaism, basically, I mean, Christ is the Redeemer, and Christ represents all that is good. Christ represents love and compassion. And Jews are made to be the ones who sadistically tortured him. He was the Son of God himself, he was God. So Jews are really positioned as the absolute evil, the absolute opposite of everything that is good, by being the killers of Christ. And that's realized in the modern day or in the contemporary times then by the libel, the blood libel that Jews murder children, murder Christian children, and use their blood to make matzah. Right, so the child really is a version of Jesus there, like a figure of innocence and purity. And you see these anti-Judaic libels emerge today around the war in Gaza, that, and they become fused as well with anti-Zionist libels. So the genocide libel is often fused with the deicide libel. So Palestinians are kind of a collective Christ. They're almost the salvation of humanity. You find that in a lot of leftist discourse. They've replaced the working class, for example, for Marxists. They will bring
Jesus was a Palestinian, sorry.
and Jesus, exactly. Jesus was a Palestinian. Even the Pope used to kind of engage in this rhetoric. He had a nativity scene where he put a keffiyeh on the baby Jesus. So it all kind of comes together. So that was the core libel, the core construction of Jews as a symbolic evil in anti-Judaism. And in anti-Semitism, of course, it's the Jew as a kind of destroyer of nations. So at that time, we were seeing kind of the emergence of the modern nation, of national identities. But we also saw these social contradictions where the attempt to create these liberal democratic states was confronted with rapid industrialization, inequality, centralization of banks, right, and capitalism. So the Jew was constructed as the manipulator of capitalism, of inequality, of finance, etc., and the kind of infiltrator of the purity and the homogeneity of these newly formed nations. Yeah, so those are the anti-Semitic libels, and so Nihil-Lex has also very elegantly kind of used this anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism frame, and discussed as well the libels that are constitutive to each.
Yeah, she has been incredibly helpful um,
Mhm.
to me. Um, okay, so then, to kind of close this out, um, you would think that by explaining, what you've just explained, that we might be able to shift the dial or at least engage in some kind of dialogue with our contemporaries. Yet, as we've both discovered, that's really, really, really difficult when these libels are so overwhelming and also so moralistic. To have somebody engage with these ideas or challenge them in any way is to have somebody question their own moral center. And you can really feel kind of corrupted by even engaging in these conversations. These are the
Mhm.
similar type of, issue we've had for a while with challenging conversations. In fact, for centuries, really. The point is that there have been differences of opinion in how best to hold conversations without even really asking ourselves whether or not they're possible around a lot of issues. And I think that possibility is stifled by these kind of moral binaries that have been created. So naturally, we might instead want to open the discussion up with some type of truth-telling enterprise, perhaps. Uh,
Mhm.
Israel has a word for this. What is that word? How has that functioned in the past? How is it functioning in the present? And Is there a way in which we should or shouldn't be imagining or reimagining that word when it comes to talking more about anti-Zionism and the harms that it produces?
I take it you're referring to Hasbara,
Yes,
which
sir.
yeah is basically just a way the Israeli government refers to public messaging, right? Which is a very normal thing that every single state does. Every single state has diplomats or spokespeople who go out into the international arena and they represent the state and they speak about try and advocate for the state's interests. Now, of course, anti-Zionists use the term Hasbara in a much broader sense than that. They basically construct all Jews marked as Zionists as constantly engaging in Hasbara, which by that they basically mean that anything that Jews say is a kind of preemptive defense against the presumed guilt that the anti-Zionist already projects onto the Jew. So because the anti-Zionist is constantly spreading these libels and desires to believe these libels on a basis of prejudice, they believe Jews sort of are always guilty. And so anything we say, actually, they then construct in a sort of conspiratorial manner as kind of an emanation of some kind of Israeli government plot to hide Israel's crimes. But what it ends up doing is being kind of a de facto delegitimization of anything we say. And so it's actually what this philosopher Miranda Fricker called epistemic injustice. So what she meant by that is that injustice sometimes is not just about kind of discriminatory or uneven outcomes in the world. It's also about the way in which certain speech is evaluated or how certain knowers are kind of distinguished. So her example was like, a rape victim, for example, often because they're a woman, right? Their testimony is not treated as valid as maybe a man's, right? So they are assumed to be more likely to lie. They're assumed to be more unreliable. So the Hasbara libel, as I call it, is basically the libel that Jews um, are all engaging in official Hasbara and are not to be ever taken seriously or as credible interlocutors on their own terms. And it's also the notion that Israeli public messaging as well is somehow more malevolent and deceptive than any other state as well. So it's not only the case that people who aren't official Israeli Hasbarists are kind of delegitimized, but there's also a sense in which Israeli Hasbara itself is delegitimized in an unnecessary way because, of course, Israel is a state that's constantly under a constant barrage of anti-Israel propaganda war, an anti-Zionist war throughout the world, also does have to kind of defend itself in the public sphere and make an effort to push back against those libels, and that's also actually kind of legitimate. So even real Hasbara is legitimate as well.
Okay, so the issue is not Hasbara, it's the libelous reconstruction of Hasbara.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the notion that Israel should always be like the term Hasbara just means explanation, right? That Israel should always be explaining itself is itself maybe flawed. I think that um, instead of explaining Israel or explaining Zionism, the real issue is to explain anti-Zionism at this point. To switch from what we call it as inward attention, where Jews are constantly responding to libels as if they're claims that one needs to actually refute or explain or debate, to outward attention, where anti-Zionism becomes the object of accusation, and it's anti-Zionism that should be held to account. So I've called it before that shift from Hasbara to Hasifa. So explaining to exposing, I would maybe say. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, you have a 4-month-old, and that is more important right now. Uh, so I'm going to let you go. But look, thank you so much for helping to explain some of those things. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I look forward to seeing what people's reactions are to some of this. And I no doubt think that you'll be peppered with another 1,000 questions, 800 of which you will have already answered well somewhere.
Oh, well, this was great. I mean, it was great talking to you, Joshua.